do a quick introduction on Dr. Frank Baumgartner. You have his bio in this week's bulletin, so I won't read that to you, but instead I just want to say a couple quick things about Frank. Last time I spoke to the club, I talked about some of the changes in policing that have been undertaken both in our community and really across the state, and some areas that still need to be tackled and that still hold promise. And I throughout those remarks, I referenced an awful lot of Dr. Baumgartner's work. And in fact, probably during that session held up my copy of his book, which I know he'll speak about some today. When he'll say that more about this too, but quickly, I just want to say this. In the state of North Carolina, starting in 1999 or around 2000, started collecting all kinds of information about police interactions with motorists in terms of traffic enforcement. And that data sat on the shelf for many, many years until Dr. Baumgartner and his team analyzed it. And probably not surprisingly, his analysis revealed some really concerning things about the disparities in traffic enforcement mistreats many folks who are on the roadway. Folks who largely look like me end up having a very much more pleasant experience at the hands of law enforcement, statistically speaking, than communities of color. And when I remember well, I was already in a police leadership position across the state of North Carolina when Frank first introduced his study, and it was not well received. It was not well received, and most communities across this state resisted even considering some of the hard truths that his work revealed about policing. I have to say how proud I am that early and after his release of that report, how willing he has been to come start talking with me and my team about how we can do better, how we can use data to provide more balanced policing in our community. I wouldn't for a minute suggest we've gotten it all figured out, but what I do want to do in front of all of you is thank Baumgartner for his hard work. He really helped kick off an important and data-driven discussion in North Carolina that needs to continue, that I believe will continue. And Frank, I just appreciate your leadership and your friendship. And I know you all will be impressed with his material today and his thoughtful and objective perspective around this important topic. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Frank Baumgartner.
Well, thanks so much, Chief Blue. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm gonna give you some really kind of troubling statistics that may or may not surprise you. I'm sure that in the abstract, they won't surprise you, especially after the introduction. And if you've been reading the news any time in the last 15 or 20 years, you won't be surprised to know that there is such a thing as driving while black. And I can show you exactly how detrimental that is statistically. But as I often tell my students, you know, sometimes we have to put a number on something. We want to know whether the disparity is a 20% difference or a 50% difference or a 200% difference. And so while it shouldn't shock you that there's a difference, it might shock you to see the degree and the ubiquity of those differences. So I'm gonna share my slides and share my screen and show you a few numbers. I'm going to start with, I wanna show you I wanna discuss for just a second the concept that I think is really important, and that is what I call the empathy gap. The empathy gap is something that I think Americans are suffering from right now. And you may not be familiar with being treated rudely or in an unfriendly manner by a police officer. For example, in my own case, like Chief Blue mentioned, because of my appearance and my social position as a middle-class white male college professor, I haven't been pulled over by the police very often in my entire lifetime. I am a pretty safe driver. My wife gets mad that I don't speed enough, but no matter, I have been pulled over a few times, and it has been, no fun No one wants to be pulled over, but it hasn't been stressful, I wouldn't say. And actually, the last time I was pulled over by a police officer was more than 25 years ago. So it's something that's quite rare. And when it does happen, it's an inconvenience, but it's not really, you know, a terrible experience. That's not the case for everybody. And so I want us to think about, and I'd like to ask you to open up your empathy to try to understand and walk a mile in someone else's shoes. And so I'm gonna ask you to think about that from another person's perspective. And then I think you might come to understand how different Americans experience the police so differently. One of the things about policing is that policing is very location focused. In what the police call the high crime area, the police act much more aggressively, and they're much more concerned about finding wrongdoers and potential criminals, whether they're involved in a criminal act at the moment or maybe they could be in the future. They want the police, they want them to know that the police are watching. In my neighborhood of South Chapel Hill, I rarely see the police. Not that they wouldn't be welcome, they would be welcomed with open arms by all of my neighbors. But we don't really need the police much in my neighborhood because it's not a high crime neighborhood. So if we do see the police, it's a very friendly interaction. And the police are not treating us as though we might be involved in some kind of crime. And that difference conditions how Americans understand the police. So I want to show you two very short videos. I probably don't have time to show you the entire video, so I'm going to cut them off. But I will share these slides with my contacts in your club, and hopefully you could have access to all of these slides and you can watch the videos yourself. And then I'm going to give you some overview of the statistics associated with the book I wrote in 2018, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. In this slide, I give you links to two videos. I want to make sure that we can see them. I've already opened them up on my computer screen, so hopefully you'll see what I'm going to show you. I want to make sure you're seeing the video.
You paint oil field equipment. Yeah. There's not a scratch in that truck. How long have you been working this truck? Man, a little over a month. There's no scratches on it. Yeah, we take care of it. It's not dirty. Yeah, we keep it clean. I smell fresh paint. Yeah, we just cleaned it. Those cones have not even touched the ground. Those cones have not touched the ground. Something is not right. I think all of this is a front. Hello? The young guy, they said, councilman, this is the front right here. Well, one way to find out, Charles, let's call this city hall. Yes, ma'am. Good morning. How are you today?
29-43
Great.
Rios.
I was wanting to ask you guys a question. Calling in reference to Guillermo Willie Rios. Is he one of y'all city councilmen? He is. Okay. I'll put it this way, brother. There may not be dope in this vehicle, but they're not working this vehicle. That's for sure. Well, I mean, yeah, that's obvious. I can see it. I mean, I can see that. It's good. We appreciate your cooperation. You understand what we do for a living. Yeah, we just want to make sure when we let you get on the road, we understand now that we have clearly have suspicion. Okay, because you understand a lot of stuff that we do, a lot of things we want to do is have somebody work on the road. So we stop them. They're still carrying what they should be carrying, whether it's dope, money, guns, kidnapped children, you know, you never know. So that's really going, man? You know, I'm 74. Then when you turned on here on Dixie, 18th Street, turned in the far left lane, you're supposed to turn in the right lane. So it's 2 lanes. Are there any weapons in the car? No drugs? You have your ID? No, you ain't got any guns, right? I'm sorry? Oh, you got street job. All good. You say something about work? Who's guys the chance on film? Do me a favor, grab the phone, you walk, so you don't. Wow. Because I'm telling you, or it's gonna fall out when you get out of the vehicle. Right? Okay. Vehicle. Oh,
Mama, they taking me out the vehicle.
Don't hop out.
They told me to get out the car in there.
That's the reason why.
I'm not sure if I did something where you can't see the slides properly. Can give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides properly. Okay. So I want to just talk a little bit about those two experiences that City Councilman Guillermo Rios in Texas was just driving, and you know, it wasn't that the state trooper accused him of kidnapping children, but he discussed that, you know, what they're looking for is such things as people who might be kidnapping children. And I can't imagine sitting through a conversation with a police officer with that insinuation. It certainly never happened to me. And then the young boy, the 18-year-old young man in Louisville, Kentucky, he just lives on the wrong side of town. And if you continue to watch that video, and I encourage you to, there's a lot of coverage of it in the Louisville newspapers over the last few years. He was an honor student, but the police were looking for weapons. And it's really fun in the video after his mother shows up at the traffic stop and starts to argue with the police officers. So I encourage you to watch it. It just gives an idea of an experience of automatic suspicion. And also I want to point out in the case of the young man in Louisville, he had technically violated the law. When he turned right, as you saw at the very beginning of the video, and as the officer told him when he pulled him over, when he turned right, he didn't pull into the far right-hand lane of traffic. He pulled into the second lane of traffic, and that's illegal. So one of the things that's interesting about driving your car is that if you're driving your car, you're breaking the law. Either you don't fully come to a stop at a stop sign, as many of us don't perfectly every time, or just to think about the options of how fast are you driving. There's only two options. You're speeding or else you're obstructing traffic. So a police officer has the legal justification to pull you over for a conversation and a short investigation if you're driving a car. So the invention of the automobile really transformed policing. So I want to give you a little bit of background about that, especially mention these two books. The first one by Sarah Seo is really an interesting project, and I'll talk about it. And then another one was done by a team of researchers in Kansas who did a survey of people about their experiences with traffic stops. But the first book about the policing the open road is about the invention of the automobile and how it transformed policing. And I would recommend it to you if you want to understand what some of this is doing. And one of the interesting things about the invention of the automobile was that the police were kind of dumbfounded by the fact that wealthy people were committing crimes. Wealthy people and farmers were the first types of people to adopt the automobile. And the police didn't expect that those people would violate the law, but they created a lot of problems. And also this corresponded with the period of prohibition and alcohol running, the invention of NASCAR associated with that. And it ended up leading to a massive decline in the public's presumption of privacy. And the US Supreme Court was eventually faced with questions about whether the analogy should be is if you're in your car, should you expect a level of privacy similar to that which you would expect to have in your home? Or is it more similar to being out on a public sidewalk? And eventually it came down to the idea that you don't have very much privacy if you're in your car. If the car is moving, you're breaking a law, so you give up your privacy because you're now a lawbreaker and the police can arrest you or investigate you for the reason of your unlawful action. And the court has always had the assumption, and I think it stems from their social identity, the members' social identity, which is similar to mine, that these momentary interventions or disruptions would be rare. Maybe every 10 years or so, someone might be pulled over. And they would be not overly stressful, because if I did indeed run through a stop sign or roll through a stop sign and I got caught by the police, I would understand that there was a good justification to call me to order. And then they wouldn't be dangerous. Okay. But that's people like me and people like most of you, I think, from seeing on the video. But Philando Castile, who died after a police traffic stop in Minneapolis, or in Minnesota near Minneapolis, turns out in investigations after his death, he had been pulled over 47 times. So those interactions with the police were neither rare nor unstressful, nor did they lack danger. Okay. And then in the other book by Epp and his colleagues, they did a survey of motorists who had been who had had the experience of a traffic stop, and they asked them about their experience. And the motorists could very easily distinguish between what they considered to be legitimate or justified traffic stops, that is when they got caught speeding or caught doing something dangerous, and when the traffic stop was actually a pretext. And you just have to think about that young man in Louisville with the illegal right turn to understand what is a pretextual traffic stop. So we make the distinction between traffic safety stops and pretextual ones. Now, we can't really do it perfectly, but we try our best. So I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to the book that Chief Blue mentioned. We were asked to analyze the traffic stop statistics, the data that were collected by the state of North Carolina. And we did so in a book that came out about a little over a year ago. And the bottom lines are very simple. Black drivers in North Carolina have about twice the odds of being pulled over compared to white drivers. Once pulled over, they have about twice the odds of being searched. So that's a 4 times difference in the odds of being searched. The typical contraband that might be found after a search of a person or a vehicle is very small amounts. Only about 10% of searches following a traffic stop lead to the arrest of the driver. There is no community in North Carolina that fails to have disparities, racial disparities, with higher rates of search of the black drivers compared to the white drivers. And the typical rates of disparities are more than 2 to 1. And every time we find a new database, for example, I'm looking at the Texas Highway Patrol right now with some students, and they happen to have a variable in their data set of what kind of car is it? Is it the brand name of the car? And so we're looking at the people who drive luxury cars versus the people who drive, you know, Chevrolet and Ford Pintos. And every time we find a new variable, we find that the stereotype applies, that the police are very clearly targeting people based on visible cues for a greater likelihood of search. So let me describe a little bit about the data. In 1996, there was an investigative report by a reporter, Joe Neff, who was working for the News and Observer. And he did a big investigation of a drug unit of the State Highway Patrol. And he found that they were targeting Black and Latino drivers on the interstate highways in North Carolina. And this led to quite a substantial controversy. And then some initiatives in the General Assembly, particularly supported by the members of the Black Caucus. And it led to the passage of a law in 1999 mandating that the Highway Patrol collect traffic stops data. North Carolina was the first state in America to mandate the collection of such data. It's now quite common in many states. It's increasingly common. And while the law applied only to the Highway Patrol in 2000, it was expanded in 2001, so that beginning on January 1st, 2002, we've got traffic stops data from every traffic stop from almost every police agency in the state of North Carolina. So it includes demographics about the driver, their age, race, and gender, why the person was pulled over, what was the outcome of the traffic stop, whether the person got a ticket or was arrested or had a warning, whether or not a search was conducted, whether or not contraband was found. And then there's an ID number for the officer, but that ID number is an anonymous number. We don't know the name of the officer or any characteristics of the officer. And then we know the time and date and the name of the agency. This is what the form looks like in its paper format. It's just a 2-page, front and back form with that information. So every traffic stop has this form filled out. Now, you might wonder, what are the odds of a person being pulled over in North Carolina? So, there's about 10 million people who live in North Carolina. And in about 2010, there were 1.7 million traffic stops. And at the low end, there was about 1 million traffic stops. And at the high end, about 1.7 million. In 2019, there was about 1.3 million traffic stops. So that means you've got any North Carolinian, depending on how much they drive, but on average, you've got about a 13% chance of being pulled over. So it's a lot of traffic stops. It's the single most common form of interaction between Americans and their police, the traffic stop. Now, in this slide, I just show you the share of the population who are Black and white. Blacks are 22% of the population, but they're 32% of the traffic stops. Or put another way, Blacks are 2 million. They number 2 million in North Carolina, whereas whites are 6.3 million. And if you divide that by the number of traffic stops of Black and white drivers, there's 0.13 or 13 traffic stops per 100 whites, but there's 22 traffic stops per 100 Black individuals living in North Carolina. Those are kind of rough estimates because obviously not everybody drives, everybody's not of driving age, etc. These are just comparisons to the population. But it suggests that, roughly speaking, the Black driver has about twice the odds of the white driver being pulled over. We calculated that number for every municipality in the state of North Carolina, about 300 municipalities. And we showed that, as you can see on the right, the share of the population that is Black is almost always less than the share of the traffic stops featuring Black drivers, or the share of the stops is higher than the share of the population on the right-hand side. And then for whites, it's the opposite. They tend to be a smaller share of the traffic stops than they represent in the local population. Black drivers, though, especially young male Black drivers, are way more likely to be searched following a traffic stop. So I want to point out some simple verities here. Female drivers are rarely searched. women do not correspond to the police officer's concept, the stereotype of the criminal actor, and certainly not of the drug courier. Women do use drugs, and I'm not sure the police are accurate in their assumption that the drug couriers are all going to be young men. But it's clear that the police, if they're looking for drugs in these traffic stops, are targeting men rather than women, that they're targeting younger people or those in their 20s rather than people of other age groups, especially older people. And they're targeting black men much more than they're targeting white men. And then finally, if you really wanted to move some drugs, you need to get an older white female to drive a Honda Accord during the morning rush hour. And that's gonna avoid police scrutiny, almost for sure. If we compare the black search rate to the white search rate, you get what we call the black-white search rate ratio. And the ratio of 1 to 1, so if it's 5% of blacks get searched and 5% of whites, the ratio is 1. If the ratio is 2, that means that the black rate is twice as high as the white rate. And what I've shown here is 1,900 observations from every police department around the country that we can find. And you can see that the average ratio is about 2.7. And there's a few municipalities around the country that have rates of search for black drivers that are 6, 7, or almost 8 times higher than their rate for white drivers. And just by the way, that tends to be in the area around Chicago, Illinois. It's not a Southern thing, and it's not peculiar to any particular area of the country. Now, we made our best statistical effort to make these disparities go away by controlling for things like why was the car pulled over, what day of the week was it, what time of day was it, etc. And it turns out that we cannot make these statistical disparities disappear by controlling for non-racial factors. I think these are, and so what you're seeing here is a comparison of that ratio that I showed you, and then what's called the odds ratio, which is the effect of race after controlling for everything that we can control for statistically. So this is a very powerful, constant effect across the entire country. Now in North Carolina, when there's a contraband seizure, it can be measured in gallons. If it's alcohol, it's measured in pints or gallons, but if it's marijuana, it's measured in ounces. And this is the distribution of how many ounces of things were seized. And you can see that the typical seizure is less than 1/2 of 1 ounce. And there's very, very few seizures more than 5 ounces. So the practice of using the traffic stops to conduct the war on drugs is truly a needle in the haystack kind of proposition. The numbers are extremely bad. It's very, very rare to find a person transporting a kilo of cocaine through the morning rush hour or at other times in their car. A traffic stop is not probably the most efficient way to find that person who's a drug courier. There's 10 reasons why you can be pulled over, according to the North Carolina statistics. Speed limit violations, which is the most common. Stop sign, stop light violations, driving while impaired, safe movement, that's swerving or not signaling a lane change, some kind of safe movement violation. And then we call those safety-related traffic stops. And then there's vehicle equipment and vehicle regulatory, that's broken taillights and expired tags, seatbelt violations, etc. So you can see all those reasons why you might be pulled over. So we think that some of these investigatory traffic stops are either easy pretexts for an officer to use because they can often find, excessive tinting on the window, or some kind of violation of the vehicle code. But these are also things that are much more commonly associated with poor people. Poor people drive cars that might not be currently registered, or they might have a broken taillight, much more likely than an upper middle class driver. So we look separately at these things related to traffic safety and then using the traffic code to investigate people. I want to show you the search rates over time. On the left, I'm showing you the search rates for Black and white females. And I want you to notice that those search rates are very, very low. They're 1 to 2% of traffic stops with female drivers lead to a search. And the racial difference is there, but it's kind of small. Black female drivers are a little bit more likely to be searched than white females, but not substantially. Whereas on the right-hand side, we're looking at the male drivers, and white male drivers have about a 2% search rate, but Black male drivers have a 5 or 6 or 7 or 8% search rate. It's much higher. Okay, so males are higher than females. Black males are much higher. And we've had a big decline in consent searching. I think Chief Blue can respond to this. I think I want to take some credit for this because it happened to begin in about 2012, which is when I first started issuing my reports. But the state of North Carolina has had a big decline in consent searches. However, we've begun to see inching up a corresponding increase in probable cause searches. Probable cause searches are when the officer has probable cause to believe that a crime may be in progress or that there's contraband, and the officer can search the car. I'm going to show you the consent, and then here we see the consent searches. A consent search is when there is no probable cause, but the officer would like to search the car anyway. So he can say, do you mind if I search your car? And you or I might be able to say, well, officer, have I committed a crime? It is, after all, my constitutional right to maintain my privacy, so I don't think I necessarily want you to look through my car. Am I being detained? And in the real world, I would never do that. Neither would you. People don't do that. They give their consent when an officer with a handgun and a taser and maybe a billy club says, I'd like to search your car now. Is that all right? It's a very intimidating prospect. And so people typically say yes. The number of consent searches, though, has dramatically declined since about 2002. And the number of consent searches that lead to the discovery of contraband and also lead to arrest is very, very low. You can see that it's less than 10%. This speaks to the question of how much bang are we getting for the buck? For every one of those contraband, for every one of those consent searches, what's the odds that we're simply alienating a young man without finding enough contraband to justify arresting him? And the answer is, it's about a 90 to 95% odds that we're going to alienate him without arresting him. 90 to 95% chance. Now, the more we know about a person, the more we can predict their odds of search. So this is kind of an analysis that I did for the city of Charlotte, where we said, well, how many targets do you have? If you're Black rather than white, we're going to call that a target. If you're young rather than old, it's the only time in life where it's better to be old. But if you're young, you've got a target. If you're male rather than female, we're going to count that as a third target. If you got pulled over in Charlotte by a white male officer, that's bad news. You've got a target. In Charlotte, we were able to find a database that had information about the race and gender of the officer. A relative rookie officer compared to a highly experienced officer, being pulled over for an investigatory reason rather than safety. And depending on the neighborhood where you got pulled over, you've got potentially up to 8 targets. And you can see the odds of search related to that. Again, in Charlotte, we were able to compare not only the the driver characteristics, so that the black male drivers got a much higher rate of search, but that city police department published a database, which they've since taken down, but I was able to make a copy of it before they took it down, and included the number of years of service, the gender, and the race of the officer who made the traffic stop. And that turns out to be almost as predictive as the characteristics of the driver. White male officers were much more aggressive in searching people. I'm going to go quickly through this section, but we distinguish between traffic safety stops and investigatory stops, and about half of all the stops are of each type, safety versus investigatory. It turns out that if you look at only the safety stops, search rates are relatively low, and the racial difference is, I'm going to say, only a 50% difference between blacks and whites. Whereas in the investigatory traffic stops, the search rates are a little bit higher, 1.3 for white drivers and 3.5 for black drivers, and 2.3 for Hispanics. And the ratio for blacks and whites in those investigatory stops, so these are the poverty related ones, the difference is 2.7. That is, the black drivers 170% more likely to be searched following an investigatory traffic stop. So we calculate a ratio for every police department. What's the share of traffic stops that are investigatory versus traffic safety? And the higher the number, the more that police department is targeting using the traffic code as an excuse to investigate people, rather than just keeping the streets safe from speeders and people running through stop signs. And so as that investigatory traffic stop ratio goes up, the search rate for blacks goes up faster than the search rate for whites. Blacks are more likely to get warnings because when they were pulled over for a pretextual reason, in the vast majority of those cases, the officer realizes he was wrong. So he lets the person go with just a warning. The citation rate for blacks becomes more similar or even higher than the rate for whites. And that might sound counterintuitive, but if you really were speeding, you deserve a ticket. If you weren't doing anything wrong, but the officer just wanted to talk to you, you might get off with a warning. So why would any of that occur? A focus on safety enforcement, that is keeping the road safe from drunk drivers, people running through stop signs, people speeding through residential neighborhoods, means that people are going to be pulled over because they really violated a safety regulation, and they'll get ticketed. And there's less racial bias because the purpose of the traffic stop was simply to sanction the bad driving behavior. But the traffic code and the vehicle code provide about 500 reasons why a police officer can pull someone over. And they provide a legal justification for a temporary investigation, temporary detainment on the side of the road. So police have become accustomed to this practice of making use of the traffic code as a way to conduct a mini criminal investigation with a conversation with the driver. And I want to point out that this did not happen until about the 1960s and 1970s. It wasn't part of the police culture, but it became part of the police culture around that time. It became a best practice. And there was a state trooper, a county sheriff in Florida who had jurisdiction over I-95, who was worried about drug couriers driving through his jurisdiction. So he started pulling over all the Hispanic and Black men. And judges in his jurisdiction kept throwing out those traffic stops because he had racially profiled the individuals. So he went back to his law books and he studied the Florida traffic code and the vehicle code. And he realized that he could find a technical violation for any of those people that he wanted to pull over. So then he trained his officers simply to first find a technical violation, find a legal justification first, then second, pull over the Black and the Hispanic drivers. And then the judges weren't able to throw out those traffic stops because there was indeed a legal justification for every traffic stop. So this is the use of the traffic code to find technical legal violations. And this has been supported by every court in the land up to the US Supreme Court. And I think that this is where I want to get back to how I started with the empathy gap. It's not going to happen to you and me. It's never happened to me. I've never been subjected to what I would think of in retrospect as a pretextual traffic stop. The only time I've ever been pulled over, I actually was speeding. Okay. But other people who are in marginalized communities may be subjected to these kinds of pretextual traffic stops. And it makes them angry. It makes them feel that the law is not applied equally. And it generates a lot of distrust and anger with the police. And I think we're all experiencing the results of this. Okay? And I'll end with this quick summary of what my research has shown. Your odds of search following a traffic stop relate to where you live, what town or what neighborhood where you live, who you are, what you look like, your age, race, and gender. The police policies, whether the police are targeting investigatory stops or traffic safety, which particular officer pulled you over, and then many other factors that we can't measure. But all the factors that I mentioned there, we can show statistically the impact of all of those things. And every visible cue that we can find when we find a new database that correlates with some kind of stereotype of the criminal profile, we can find evidence that that is happening out on the roads. So this is what's coming in the door to the court system. And it should be no wonder with that what we see going out is hugely disparate outcomes based on race. So I'll stop there. I'll share these slides with your organizers, and you can certainly look at them and write me and ask me any questions.
Professor, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. Very interesting information, concerning and eye-opening on a number of levels. But thank you very much for sharing your expertise and the results of all of your work. So grateful for you being with us, folks. Thank you for staying with us today. Wish everybody a safe and a happy weekend, and we'll look forward to checking in again in a week. My best to everybody.
All right, thank you.